getting to know your sewing machine. In this video, I'm going to walk you through all the basic components of your sewing machine so that way you can get started sewing with confidence. So let's jump right in because I know that you're excited to learn everything there is to know about your sewing machine. So the first thing you need to know about your sewing machine is that it is broken down into 3 parts. And those parts are the bed, which is the bottom part of your sewing machine where the fabric lays while you're sewing. The head, which is the top part of the machine where all of your top thread, buttons and switches and needle and everything else are located. It's really the biggest part of the machine. It does all the adjustments that you need for sewing. And the third part is the throat, and that's the space between the two, between the bed and the head. So let's talk about the bed first. So the first part of the bed that we're going to talk about is the needle or throat plate. And that is this silver piece of metal right in the middle of your machine under the needle. Okay? Now, the next thing is the feed dogs. Now, the feed dogs are these 4 pieces of metal that come up through the needle plate. And what they do is they come up and they actually are what move your fabric through the sewing machine. So they come up, they go back, they go under that needle plate, and then come back up again. And you see they also move in sync with the needle. So what's happening is it's coming up above the needle plate, wrong hand, coming up above the needle plate, the feed dogs are, then they're moving towards the back of the machine, going under that needle plate, and then coming up again. And what that does is it naturally moves your fabric through the machine without you having to do anything. So if you've sewn at all, you've noticed that you basically put your foot on the pedal and the fabric just starts moving on its own. And the reason it does that is because of the feed dogs. Okay? So after the feed dogs, we have the seam allowance guides, and these are guides to help you keep or maintain the correct amount of seam allowance while you're sewing. So I'm going to show you a couple of different placements on these guidelines. Here's kind of a middle position, and what seam allowance is it's the distance from the needle to the edge of your fabric. So as I move my fabric out, like I did just now, I have a greater seam allowance. And now as I move this direction, I have a smaller seam allowance. While you're sewing, you'll always need to read your pattern and figure out how much seam allowance you need. Then you can take your fabric and line it up with one of those seam allowance guides to make sure you keep the same amount of distance the entire time you're sewing. That's what they're there for. So after the seam allowance guides, we have the accessory storage. Now, the accessory storage is typically the front part of the bed of your machine, and you can remove it. And once you remove it, you'll see that 1, it's hollow, but 2, it has a little door on it. And if you open the door, you can put all of your sewing supplies inside, and it makes keeping all of your sewing supplies together with your sewing machine so easy. So that is the bed of the sewing machine. And after the bed, we're going to talk about the throat, this area between the bed and the head. And really, we're going to focus on the area near the needle because that's where all the good stuff is. So when we talk about the throat, the first thing we're talking about is the presser foot. Now, the presser foot is this, and the first thing is there's a bunch of different types of presser feet. There are about 1 million probably, but most commonly you're just going to be using the universal foot that all machines come with, okay? Now, what the presser foot does is it actually presses down on the top of your fabric. So you can think of sewing kind of like a sandwich. So the feed dogs are the bottom, your fabric is the filling, and the presser foot is on top. So as the presser foot presses down and the feed dogs press up and move the fabric through, that is what happens while you're sewing. And that's how your fabric stays nice and pressed together and doesn't get moved all out of position while you're sewing. Okay? So the presser foot, yep, we just talked about. Next we have the needle, and I'm pretty sure you already know what the needle looks like. It's this. It's what actually takes the thread through the fabric. Then we have the needle clamp. It's typically a little screw, and if you unscrew it or make it loose, the needle will fall out, and that's how you can actually replace it. You loosen the needle clamp, take the old needle out, put the new one in, tighten the clamp, and you're good to go and ready to start sewing again. So after the needle clamp, we have the presser foot lifter. Now it's actually located on the back of the machine, as you can see here. And what this does is it raises and lowers the presser foot. So first I'm going to raise the presser foot. There it goes, raising it up. And then I'm going to push it down. And now it's in the down position. So that's all you have to do to raise and lower your presser foot. Next is the light. It is usually located right above the needle, but you really can't see it because it's kind of inside the machine. But when you turn the machine on, you'll definitely see it. And then these are two optional features. So your machine might or might not have them. But if your machine does have an automatic needle threader, you will find it right here. It's this little white plastic tab that comes out of the top of the head, out of the bottom of the head of the machine. Okay? Now, if your machine has a one-step buttonhole lever, it will be located right here, just behind the automatic needle threader. Now, if you look closely at this, you'll see that on the one-step buttonhole lever, there is a down arrow, the word push, and then right next to it is a little rectangle. Now, just in case you forget what that particular lever is for, I want to show you this. So this is the symbol for a one-step buttonhole. It's this rectangle with the dark bars on the top and bottom and little slash marks all the way down the sides. So you'll see this on your stitch selector we'll be talking about later. But if that helps remind you that this is for your one-step buttonhole. So if you ever look at your machine and you see this little tab and you're like, what is that again? Just remember that little rectangle means one-step buttonhole. Okay? So that is the throat of the machine. And now we're going to talk about the head. Now, like I said earlier, the head of the machine really is the bigger chunk. It has all of your stitch selections and tension adjustments and threading the top. There's a lot that goes on in the head. So we're actually going to break the head down into 4 parts, okay? Keep using the wrong hand. I'm sorry, guys. Into 4 parts. So those 4 parts are the front, which you can see mostly in this picture, the faceplate, which is the left side of the machine, the top of the machine, and the right side of the machine. So we're going to start with the faceplate and work clockwise around. So on the faceplate, there's usually not a lot going on. It's typically just this one little thing. That's the thread cutter. Now, I know it just looks like a tiny little piece of plastic, but it's actually really, really nice feature because it works like this. As you finish up sewing, you're always going to have 2 threads connected to your project. Now you need to cut them. So what you can do is wrap them over the top of this needle cutter and pull down. and it will cut the threads for you. You don't need to grab a pair of scissors or try to hold your project and figure out wherever you put them. There's a built-in cutter right there on the side of your machine. How neat. So that is the faceplate, or the left side of the machine. Now we're going to move to the top of the machine. Now there's a lot of little things up here, but we're going to go through them, so don't worry. The first two things are for the bobbin, and that's the bobbin stopper and the bobbin winding spindle. Now both of these are used for filling a bobbin, and if you don't know how to do that, be sure to check out my bobbin winding video where I go into more detail on those two features. So after those, we have the handle, which is actually the correct way to carry your machine. It's really common and easy for people just to grab the machine any which way, especially somewhere in the throat, in that area between the head and the bed, but it's actually not good for your machine. The best way to pick up your machine is with the handle. That's why it's there. So try to remember to use it if you can, okay? So, handle, nifty. Then we have the horizontal spool pin. So this is where you're going to put your top thread. It slips right on there, easy peasy. Now, the next two little silver pieces on top that we see here are upper thread guides. So these are just used to guide your upper thread to the needle to make sure it doesn't get all like knotted up or lost or stuck on anything. It's a nice clean trail just to keep your thread from getting tangled, okay? So the number 6, the next one, is actually part of this as well. So this is your thread take-up lever. And it's also part of guiding your thread to the needle, but this helps with tension. So you want to make sure that your thread goes through that when you're threading your machine. Next, we have the bobbin thread guide. So again, this piece, number 7, works with pieces 1 and 2 when you're winding a bobbin. And finally, we have up here, kind of hard to see, but it's this little circular indentation. And what that is, it's a little plastic cap that I can take out and actually put in a second spool pin. So I can have 2 threads on the top of my machine. And this is not a feature that's on all sewing machines, which is why I have that in a dashed line. But if your machine does have a second spool pin, it's typically located right in that area. And what that's used for is when you work with stretch fabric, or there are a couple other sewing techniques where you need 2 top threads. So when you're going to use 2 top threads, you need 2 spools, and that's what that feature is for. Okay, so that's everything on the top of the machine. We'll talk about these other 2 when we get to the front of the machine, so don't worry. We'll talk about these other 2 when we get to the front of the machine, so don't worry. So next, we're going to move to the right side of the machine. Now on the right side of the machine, we have what's called the hand wheel. And that's this big wheel that you see on the side of the machine, and it's used to manually move the needle up and down. Now, when you use this, you always want to turn it towards you or towards the front of the machine. It's just better for your sewing machine that way. So if you can remember, turn it towards you. Now, what this looks like, one second, and go, is like this. So you see I'm manually moving it, and you can see the needle moving up and down on the other side of the machine. So if the needle's ever in a position that you don't like maybe you finish sewing and you want to take your fabric out, but the needle's down in the fabric, that's not going to work. So just pop on over to the hand wheel, turn it a little bit, get the needle out of your way, then you can move your fabric out easily, okay? So next we have the power and light switch. And typically when you turn the power on, the light automatically comes on. So they're a 2-for-1 switch. Then below that, we have the main plug socket. And that's where you're going to plug in your power cord, which is this. And your power cord is almost always directly connected to your foot pedal. So the power cord plugs into your machine, and then your foot pedal is used just like the gas pedal in a car. You press your foot on it, and the harder you press, the faster your machine will go. And that's how you actually control the speed of your sewing machine while you're sewing. So that's the right side of the machine. Now we're going to move to the front. Okay, now on the front of the machine, for most brands, most models, the front changes. Oh, but don't worry. First, I'm going to talk you through what each of these features does so you know why you need it. And then I'm going to show you where it is on my machine. Then, once we know what the features are, I'll show you how to find all the same features on your machine. So don't worry if your machine doesn't look just like mine. We're just going to cover what these features are, and then I'll show you where they are on your machine. Okay? So, the first feature we're going to talk about is the reverse function. So my reverse button is right here. And the reason that the reverse is super important is because it actually creates what's called a lock stitch. So let me show you. So here, you can see that I'm stitching forward, yay. And then you'll notice that my right hand disappears, and I'm actually pressing down that reverse. So, did you see that? The fabric was going one direction into the machine, and then when I moved my right hand away, I hit the reverse button, and the fabric moved in the opposite direction. Let me show you one more time, just in case you missed it. So, here is the machine going in the forward direction, the normal forward direction, and my right hand will disappear, and I press the reverse, and then it starts going backwards. Now, what that does is it actually creates what's called a lock stitch, and that's what this is. You can see here that my stitches are coming forward, a thin line, and then it gets fatter starting here. So what happens is I stitched forward down to here, then I hit the reverse button and went back. That's why it looks fatter right here, because there's 2 lines of stitches. Now those 2 lines of stitches create a lock stitch. And what that really means is that your stitches aren't going to come out over time on accident. If you don't do the lock stitch, you'll find that your threads at the very end are kind of like this. And if you are like wearing a t-shirt or you make a pouch and these ends get messed with or pulled on, they'll start to come unraveled. And you don't want that for your projects. You want your seams to stay nice and finished and not come undone. So that lock stitch actually goes over the stitch line, keeping all of them locked in position so that it doesn't come accidentally unraveled. So that reverse is super important, and you want to make sure that every time you start a stitch line and end a stitch line, to do that reverse function, okay? So that's the reverse. The next feature is the thread tension dial. And if you ever notice that your threads are super loose and loopy or so tight that it's making your fabric scrunch up, you're gonna wanna adjust the tension, and that's where you do it, right there on that tension dial. Now, the next one is the stitch width and needle position. So this looks like this on close-up, so you can see a little bit better. And this actually does two things. So you can see it has like a 5, 4, 3, and it goes down to 0. And what this does is it adjusts the distance that the needle moves from left to right. So think about stitches like zigzag stitches. You need to be able to move left, right, okay? But how far to the left and how far to the right? That is where this adjustment comes in. So the further I move it to 0, the smaller the number, the smaller my zigzag. That's what it's showing here on the left-hand side. This is probably a 1, I think. Now this one in the middle is a 3, and the one on the end is a 5. So you can see that the higher I go, the wider my zigzag gets. And that's what this adjustment is doing. It's adjusting the width of your stitch. Now, the other thing that this adjustment can do is change your needle position. So what happens when you're doing a straight stitch? In a straight stitch, the needle only stays in one position and moves up and down. It doesn't move from left to right, it just stays in one spot. So when you adjust the width and your stitch isn't moving the needle left and right, what you end up adjusting is the position of the needle. And that looks like this. So as I adjust as I adjust the width, you see the needle moving back and forth. So if I ever need to get the needle in a very specific position with regard to what I'm sewing, I can adjust it just a little bit, however much I need, using that width adjustment, okay? So that's pretty cool. And then the last thing is, oh no, 2 more. The next thing is the stitch length. So what this does is it changes the length of the straight stitch. So you can see here on the left-hand side, if I move my dial down to 1, I get these really tiny stitches, really closely together. And then the higher I move it, so this is a 3, and again, this is a 5, the distance between stitches, so stitch, 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 the distance between stitches gets bigger or smaller. Depending on if I'm using a bigger number, I get bigger stitches. A smaller number gives me smaller stitches. Now, super tiny stitches mean you have lots of points holding the fabric together. So if you need something to hold super, super well, be really, really durable, never ever in a million years come apart, you're gonna use really tiny stitches. So that is a bit extreme. So most commonly, you'll just use something in the middle range. Something like 3 is perfect for almost all projects. Clothing, zippered pouches, pillowcases, 3s are perfect. But if you go really, really big and you're going to like a 5, those are typically used, that stitch length is typically used for temporary stitches. So if you want to sew something just to see what it looks like, to see if you got it right, or to do a practice, use a large stitch length. Because there are so few stitches, it's much easier to take out. So a pro tip for beginners, set your stitch length to 5 for anything you're sewing, and once you check to make sure it's right, move it down to a 3, then sew it again. That way, in case you mess up, it's really easy to take out that first line of stitches, sew it right, and then sew in your final layer of stitches, okay? So that's really cool. And then we have the, whoops, sorry guys, the stitch selector. So what this is this is how you actually switch between zigzag stitches, straight stitches, stretch stitches, buttonholes, use this knob to pick what kind of stitch you're going to be using. And that's located right there on my machine. So, what happens if your machine doesn't look anything like my machine? Don't worry. All you need to do is check your manual. Now, I know that manuals are one of those things that we open the box, pull the thing out that we bought, and throw away the manual immediately. And while I do the exact same thing for almost all of my things I buy, sewing machines are the exception. When you have a question about how to do something on your specific machine or where something specific is located, your manual is the answer. It was written specifically for your machine. So all the special little details that are just for you and your machine are in that manual. Now, if you have a new machine, great. You already have your manual, it's in the box. If somehow you lost your manual or you threw it away, don't worry. All you need to do is jump on Google and type in the brand and the model of sewing machine that you have. So for mine, I have a Singer and the model is a 3232. So I typed that into Google and I found a PDF version of my manual and I just download it to my computer and I can reference it whenever I need it. So don't worry if you don't have your manual, I'm sure you can find it on the internet, okay? So once you have your manual, you're going to want to flip to the table of contents or just the first couple of pages and look for something called the principal parts of the machine. And what that will give you is this, and it's so cool. It's a call out of all the features and parts of your machine. So here's number 1, it comes over and goes down. That's the thread tension dial, just like I showed you on the couple slides ago. Then number 2, here, it's my thread take-up lever. And then it's something a little bit more interesting. Let's see, my one-step buttonhole lever, number 12. So if I find 12, oh, there it is. Perfect, okay? So if your machine doesn't look like mine, be sure to grab your manual and go through the features that I listed here and find them on your machine. It might even be a good idea if you're especially new to sewing or just new to your machine to keep your manual near you while you're sewing, or just print off those little pages of the callouts. I find that when I have a new machine and I'm wondering, wait, how do I adjust the width again? That it's really nice just to look over, grab that call out that I just showed you, this page, and check it and say, oh, that's where it is. Perfect. It makes sewing much easier and I don't have to get as frustrated just trying to like guess. Not as fun. So those are the primary features of your sewing machine, of most sewing machines. So I hope this helped you. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments below, and happy sewing.